Dr. BMN College of Home Science, Mumbai. And we are very glad to have you all with us today, whether you're joining from across India or around the world. This conference comes together in the wake of a great loss, the passing of Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. But even in his passing, his presence continues to inspire many. He was a radical thinker who transformed how we understand literature, language, power. Through his seminal works, he challenged colonial systems and reclaimed space for languages, indigenous languages and stories. And we owe this shape and spirit of this gathering to two wonderful scholars. I am honored to introduce you to Dr. Mala Pandurang, the principal and professor at Dr. BMN College of Home Science, Empowered Autonomous. A passionate researcher, her work is primarily focused on African writing in English, gender studies, and diaspora theory. She's a postdoctoral fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, Germany, and served as its ambassador scientist to India from 2019 to 2021, and again from 2022 to 2024. Her research also has been supported by several prestigious fellowships, including the Fulbright Visiting Professorship USA, the Charles Wallace Research Grant UK, and the Dr. Arun Tikekar Fellowship from the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. In 1994, she was awarded a PhD for her thesis, The Changing African Consciousness, a social literary study of the novels of A. Kwe Arma, Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, and Eskia Mafali. It was perhaps one of the early PhD theses in India focused entirely on African writing. She also co-edited a collection of critical essays on Ngũgĩ's body of work and has taught several of his texts over 2 decades at Mumbai University and Ascendity Women's University. She's currently the series editor for Postcolonial Lives published by Brill. Nandini C. Sen is a professor of English at the University of Delhi. She was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. She is a recipient of Charles Wallace Fellowship for Academic Research in London, the Ambassador for Peace Prize for her work towards educating slum dwellers, and the Write India Award for creative writing. She writes on diaspora studies, African studies, and comparative literature. Some of her academic publications include The Black Woman Speaks, a study of Flora Nwapa, Through the Diasporic Lens, Volumes 1 and 2, 2017 and 18, and Mashweta Devi, Critical Perspectives, 2012. Her short stories have also been featured in literary journals such as The Elusive Genre and The Muse. She has been featured in the Asian Collective of Short Stories and the Australian-India collaboration, The Glass Walls. Her recent book, The Second Wife and Other Stories, 2022, is a collection of critically acclaimed feminist stories. She serves as an academic advisor on the panel of multiple DPS schools. This conference is the result of their shared commitment and collaboration, and we're extremely grateful to them for making this happen. I now invite Professor Dr. Mala Pandurang to set the context for today's session and begin the conference by introducing our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Rima. And good morning to Dr. Somjee. Good afternoon from those who have joined from the parts of the world where it is still noon, and good evening to everybody from India. As Rima rightly pointed out, in May 2025, the world of post-colonial scholars was deeply saddened by the passing on of Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, a towering writer, thinker, and activist, and a titan of modern African writing. As one reviewer aptly put it, Ngũgĩ was at once iconic and iconoclastic. Ngũgĩ's work, which spanned roughly 6 decades across genres, has profoundly affected an entire generation of scholars and students, especially those shaped by the struggles and hopes of the post-colonial aftermath. His bold call as early as 1967 for the abolition of the English department, his radical vision in decolonizing the mind, and his commitment to the intersection of the power of the word and struggle for justice and from the barrel of the pen resonates in our minds today. I often remember his quotation. I often remember his words, and I quote, A word is more powerful than a bullet. It can kill, build, heal, or destroy a whole people. His novel, Petals of Blood, offers a scathing critique of neo-colonialism, a term that still resonates, still agitates, and still inspires reflection. And his dedication to the people's theater redefined the writer not just as a creator of the text, but as a committed activist rooted in community, resistance, and liberation. This conference has been conceived as a tribute to honor Ngũgĩ's powerful influence, to reflect on his intellectual legacy, and in all honesty, we planned it to raise more awareness of a writer whom we, the organizers, feel has not yet received his due either in the academy or in broader public discourse. We set out a call for paper and expected a few responses, and we were genuinely moved by the tremendous response that we received across India. We had to come down to 70 abstracts, which we honed still further, selecting only 30. And we're going to have presenters from senior scholars, researchers, and academicians over the next 3 days, covering all the genres that Ngũgĩ expressed himself in. And so what was originally planned as a one-day event has now grown into a 3-day conference. I think that itself is a testimony to Ngũgĩ's enduring relevance and the urgency of the questions he leaves us with today. This evening, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our keynote and plenary speakers this evening. Our keynote, Dr. Sultan Somjee, and our plenary speakers, Professor Nwanko and Professor McLaren, and also to Dr. Justice Makoka, who will join us tomorrow, for accepting our invitation to join us across time zones. Thanks to my co-organizers, Professor Nandini Sen and Dr. Eti Sharma from Bharati College, Delhi, and to my super efficient partner on the BMN side, Ms. Rima Jose, participants, chairs, and speakers who will be with us over the next 3 days, and a warm welcome to those who are viewing this public lecture on the YouTube link. I now take great pleasure in welcoming Dr. Sultan Somjee, and it is a great honor that he has accepted our invitation. I have long been following Dr. Sultan Somjee's work as a writer who beautifully captures experiences of African nations and the Indian Ocean world. And I followed his work with admiration for over 2 decades, starting with Bead By and then Home Between Crossing. And then when reviewing his book called The One Who Dreams is called a Prophet, which is a remarkable treatise on the discourse of non-violence akin to Gandhian association of Ahimsa. And while I was doing an interview with him, I discovered his close association with Ngũgĩ, which really moved me. And I thought that there could be no better person to give the keynote today than Dr. Sultan Somjee. Dr. Somjee has a very interesting book which he calls, which talks about using artifacts to build up stories. And it is very interestingly titled as The Story of Things. He has introduced learning of African art through material culture in the school curriculum in Kenya in 1985, and he was the head of ethnography at the National Museums of Kenya from 1994 to 2000, and started a very unique and innovative venture called the Community Peace Museums in the decade of high conflicts through the massacres in Rwanda in 1994. Today, the museums have spread from Kenya to other regions of Eastern Africa, And in 2000, the United Nations named Dr. Somjee as one of the 12 global unsung heroes of dialogues among civilizations. And for those of you who are venturing into South-South studies, and we know so little about the tremendous work that is being done in the global South, I urge all of you to look up this remarkable piece of work that Dr. Somjee has done. One of his books, Who Dreams is Called a Prophet, was launched by Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o in 2020. And today it's a university text on decolonization and indigenous knowledge in Kenya. And currently, Dr. Somjee teaches at the Tangaza University in Nairobi. In fact, when I was interviewing Dr. Somjee on this particular book and the fascinating notion of the peace walk and the peace staff, that he mentioned his close association with Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, and that shows the level of humility of this remarkable scholar. In 1975, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o recruited Dr. Somjee in the underground movement, and they worked together with Ngũgĩ wa Miri and Dr. Kimani Jechao, side by side with a community of workers and peasants to create the Kamirupi Theatre. In fact, we often discuss Ngũgĩ's movement with theatre in Indian classrooms, and here we have with us this evening someone who has personally worked as part of the movement, and we are indeed, I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. As we are aware, the play was banned and the theatre demolished by the dictatorial government of Jomo Kenyatta in 1977, and Ngũgĩ was put into detention. The other two fled into exile. And today we have Dr. Sultan Somjee, who is going to talk about the Indian in my life, Ngũgĩ in the Indian's life, reflections on dreaming Kamirutu. And we are all waiting to hear what you say. So thank you, Dr. Somjee, for being here with us. And the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Pandurang, and thank you, Rima Jose, for being with me on technical issues. I always have technical issues with my computer. I speak from the unceded homelands of the First Nations, renamed Vancouver on colonization. I honor the ancestors of the land. I greet you all. The Indian in my life, Ngũgĩ in the Indian's life. Reflections on dreaming Kamaridu. Two words, reflections and dreaming, carry emotions that can be personal. As personal as characters of Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, out of his relationships, sensory observations, and memory. As personal as he always wanted me to be, looking at myself as an Indian working by his side in Kamiridu, his village. I'm honored for the invitation to speak about Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o before time breaks my memory into entangled sentiments on a ruddy horizon, dreaming about our half a century of friendship and working together in comradeship. I speak in that spirit today. In the article, Indian in My Life, that predates his other better-known article, Asia in My Life, published in Frontline 2013, Ngũgĩ writes, after I wrote my memoir of childhood, I looked back and saw how much India, an equally important thread in my life, had been. There it was, staring at me right from the pages of my narrative. In 2019, when I met Ngũgĩ, this time in North America, at the Afrocentrism conference in Vancouver, He asked me if I wrote in Gujarati. I told him Indians in Gujarati were colonized too, like Africans. For those like me who lived their formative years in the 1950s, the decade of the Mau Mau uprising, Indian mother tongues were suppressed and even punishable in schools. So unfortunately, Ngũgĩ, I do not write in Gujarati. But again, on our WhatsApp talk, as recently as a few months ago, he would ask the same question and I would give him the same answer. Ngũgĩ says that meeting Indians as his equals for the first time as an adult was at the University of Makerere in Kampala. Like me, Ngũgĩ was born under colonialism. We grew up in an apartheid country where one saw the other race at a distance. Apartheid was removed from Kenya after independence in 1963. But in Indian life, burdened by caste and inward religious communalism, racism lingered. Ngũgĩ alludes to that in various ways, like how his people, the Kikuyu, had adopted the Indian word jungali that was hurled at African workers by their Indian employers. When I was asked to speak about Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o at the June 2024 symposium celebrating him in Atlanta, Georgia, the USA, I could not think of what I could say that had not already been said about Ngũgĩ's illustrious writing career. For over 6 decades, Ngũgĩ has mirrored the Kenyan society severely condemned colonialism paranoid politicians revealing the insidious schemes of the colonized minds, a fertile ground for nationalism to thrive. He won hearts in schools of Kenya, Africa, and the diaspora. Today, on social media platforms such as the far-reaching Kenya Left Forum, Ngũgĩ continues to inspire the African youth. Ngũgĩ is a torch in the Gen Z rebellion as it gathers a momentum against misrule and the predatory economics of Euro-American capitalism that has left the continent dry to its bones. The context of many of Ngũgĩ's writing, where he has grotesque characters of this class. Ngũgĩ's play with Michere Mugo, The Trial of Dedan Kimathi, continues to have multiple shows in Kenya, inspiring the youth of this generation. So does the people-made drama Gaika Denda, I Will Marry When I Want, co-authored with Ngũgĩ wa Merie, that made Kamiridu dream, that shook the fascist regime, that created rural and entire people-centered movements in Kenya and Zimbabwe, that is reminiscent in Kamiridu Afterlives, a YouTube series that give the community voices on the media. So I asked Ngũgĩ over the phone, what can I say about you that at the celebration of your life that has not already been said? He said to my surprise, speak about Kamiridu as an Indian. What did he mean as an Indian? I waited, I thought. There was an in-tone mode in it, as in his other statements left to the listeners to make meaning. Did you mean how I saw myself through my ethnic lens in his Kikuyu village? Was Ngũgĩ telling me to write about as an outsider? Yet I was trying to assimilate and show myself one with the people as a fourth-generation African of Indian descent. Moreover, I was an idealist socialist, like in the book. an intellectual from the university working with the grassroots community, demonstrating patriotism, defying racism, and gallantly putting an ideology to practice. I resented what Ngũgĩ told me. To be called in India by a colleague in university was like being called by the N-word by a friend in the USA. That was the decade of the state's demonization of Indians, also called Asians, a par excellence characterization of Shylock the Jew in Merchant of Venice and Walter Scott's Jew in Ivanhoe. English literature taught in schools had rubbed Euro-racism into the skins of the educated African elite politicians, and they weaponized it to strengthen ethno-nationalism like the English, the Germans, and other Europeans before them. I resented Ngũgĩ, a comrade, for not accepting me as a Kenyan, as equal a citizen as he was, yet he knew, wrote, and spoke about Indian labor and resistance to imperial rule in Kenya. Ngũgĩ measured patriotism on the scale of working class labor and people's resistance to any form of state oppression. In his foreword to Nira Kent Kapila's fact-inundated book on the building of the Kenya-Uganda Railway, he writes that both in the European and African narratives, I quote, "The Indian tends to be marginalized, as if he was simply a bystander. Kapila's narrative restores the centrality of the Indian in making of modern Kenya." I came to know Ngũgĩ closely through hush-hush midnight exchanges and clandestine work moving about the night like shadows of urban gorillas. I speak about Ngũgĩ from that place of fear and daring to take the socialist dream to the people. In the cell, Ngũgĩ spoke about the rich and the poor, colonialism and post-colonialism, and the creation of the self-admiring comprador class, as if he was narrating from his early classics, Weep Not Child, The River Between, A Grain of Wheat. It was the era of rising nationalism and its other side, the state-led suppression of the history of the Mau Mau as a liberation movement that is exalted in Ngũgĩ's plays. The Trial of Dedan Kimathi made this storytelling musical drama into a national epic. Gaika Denda made a people's epic. Both epics resurrect the memory of Mau Mau that the ruling class abhorred. Ngũgĩ was my cell leader in a group of 3. In the December 12th movement, DTM, also called because Kenya's Independence Day is on December 12th. We walked from practice, the word that Ngũgĩ often emphasized, to learn to speak to the people and write papers from that learning defiantly of the exploitative power. In his office, Ngũgĩ created literary prose, lyrics, and word aesthetics out of the practice of listening to the communities that won him global accolades, that touched hearts, that maddened the corrupt capitalist classes. With comrades of DTM, he worked on clandestine literature outside the ivory tower and the Hall of Fame, a tradition that has inspired some of the greatest writers in history who have been imprisoned. Gorky comes to my mind, Maxim Gorky of Russia, and so many others. and the books were banned. At the university, we began reading Petals of Blood that mocked greed and those serving corporations and foreign governments for a fee. Those were the two sides of Ngũgĩ I knew. The Ngũgĩ, the radical professor writer, and Ngũgĩ, an active revolutionary underground organizer and a writer. The world that knows him as a writer who awakened Africa to decolonization also knows him as one who stands among giants of African literature in English and French. Writers like Chinua Achebe, Osame Sembene, Ama Ata Aido, Wole Soyinka. Oh, there are so many who have galvanized the continent through storytelling to an understanding of what colonialism was, what neocolonialism is, and the class structure of the post-independent African societies. He influenced universities and schools to change syllabi that imitated the North. He stood for leaders and Pan-Africanists by Pan-Africanists slayed by the CIA, so a black ruling class may be cultivated, tethered to Washington. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, Patrice Lumumba of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and Kenya's own Pio Gama Pinto. The list is endless. Ngũgĩ brings home what theories of racism and anti-colonialism in Africa and the global black diaspora have so eloquently written about. Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney, Samir Amin, Nawal al-Saadawi. There are so many more of African upbringing and nurturing of the mind. The other Ngũgĩ in the cell was Ngũgĩ wa Merie. He was the co-author of Gaika Denda and the pillar of the theatre in Kamaridu. He was an adult studies tutor and a passionate follower of two Brazilians, Paulo Freire, the writer of Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and Augusto Boal, the dramatist writer of Theatre of the Oppressed. Interestingly, Kenya's own Theatre of the Oppressed, Kamiridu, developed in the same decade with the same purpose, working with the downcast of the society through drama. In the same decade, interestingly also, Indian activist artists engaged the centuries-old People's Political Theatre led by Indian People's Street Theatre Movement and Jana Natya Manch to act out the right of the poor to breathe. These are exemplars of South-South literary activism of a people who share traditions that speak to values of morality, that shows dignity of the human race, that shows utu in Swahili, that means humanity, comes from the word utu, which means human. It was Ngũgĩ's dream for more Caribbean, South American, Asian, and African literary interchanges exemplified in the syllabus he wrote for the University of Nairobi in the 1960s, late 1960s. But how did Ngũgĩ see the Indian in Kamiridu? Because Ngũgĩ wanted me to speak about Kamiridu as an Indian, I wondered if he saw me as a representation, some kind of a cultural Indian in his eyes, and not an activist Kenyan like he was, though an Indian. When I was recruited by him in the underground, I felt I was walking on the path set by my Indian revolutionary ancestors. Ngũgĩ knew this aspect of Asian African history well, in fact, more than I did. And he was even had pictures and literature from the Asian African Heritage Exhibition in Nairobi, 2000 to 2005. The tradition of Indian revolutionaries is traceable at least from 1896, when coolies arrived to build the Kenya-Uganda railway, with underground newspapers wrapped in their turbans and freedom songs on their lips. This was during the great India freedom movement. In storytelling, the Indian coolies spoke. In songs, they sang, weaving into the fabric of the seething African liberation movements. Ngũgĩ mentions the little-known Indian Kenyan worker activist Bishan Singh was hanged in 1915. I've also heard other dates, 1914 and 1919. Never has anyone else mentioned him apart from in the Sikh oral history on social media. In a poem he wrote to Zarina Patel, he reminds us of two other Kenya Indians, Makhan Singh, the founder of the radical trade union movement, and P.O. Gama Pinto. Zarina, who passed away in April last year, was a member of the underground who has written extensively about the Kenya Asians' resistance to colonization in biographies of patriots. Ngũgĩ reminds us about the close work that Manilal Desai, an activist lawyer journalist, and Harry Thiku, the leader of the workers' movement, did that led to protest march against carrying of the pass called Kipande that resulted in a massacre in 1922. It was as in Amritsar in 1919 that Rabindranath Tagore spoke in anger immediately after. Simba Times of 1922, a Kenyan Indian radical newspaper, published pictures of the two massacres side by side and boldly called it the end of the empire, a significant statement on comparable India-Kenya freedom movements. There's also a comparable story of the Indian mine workers in South Africa brutalized by the police during the Gandhi-led protest against carrying of the pass or the Kipande. In various ways and sites, Ngũgĩ pays tributes to the Indian workers, writers, and intellectuals in Kenya who have contributed to the making of what he calls modern Kenya, underpinning the South-South bond that we have had in history. This is suggested in his foreword to Shiraz Durrani's leading-edge book on the history and the struggle of freedom of the press in Kenya. Kenyan Asian journalists and intellectuals used the barrel of the pen to contest racism and colonialism side by side with African compatriots, sharing the ink and the handpress in one office down River Road in Nairobi, printing in both Indian and African languages adjacent to each other. Finally, the Department of English at the University of Nairobi was changed to the Department of Literature in the 1960s, late 1960s. And Ngũgĩ won the long contest as well as admiration in the academia. One of the first books that Kenyan students read was by Mulk Raj Anand, Coolie. Mulk Raj Anand is known as the father of Indian literature in English, as you all know, I'm sure. Wahome Mutai, Kenya's most cherished journalist, whose satirical humor directed at the ruling class captured popular imagination, wrote his MA thesis on Coolie. Much read thesis, actually. Ngũgĩ even recruited a lecturer from India to teach literature at the University of Nairobi. In our conversations, Ngũgĩ sometimes talked about the questions of morals, he asked me, in Mahabharata, and he struggled to understand the Indian religio-cultural mythological frame of thought. In different ways and situations, I heard Ngũgĩ speak about the question he had been pestering me with. Do you write in Gujarati? For example, when there was a disagreement among African students of diverse ethnicities at a gathering at the University of British Columbia in 2019 about the most suitable single national language for Pan-Africanism and one African identity truncated at the Berlin Conference of 1884, Ngũgĩ said it was when one spoke in one's mother tongue that it made an orchestra. That an orchestra was not complete without the sound of a missing instrument. He would repeat the metaphor a year later when he launched my book, One He Dreams is Called a Prophet, in 2020. Was he hinting at me to write in Gujarati? Again, as usual, I couldn't tell. For Ngũgĩ, mother tongue was a tool against imperialist colonial dominance. It was where the heart of the people was, where it contained their values, history, and culture, the three-sided tool to resist cultural dominance. And as Nelson Mandela has said, when one speaks in one's mother tongue, it reaches the heart. But the other thing he said that bothered me, speak about Kamiridu as an Indian. Did he not want me to speak about Kamiridu from the people's perspective, the socialist perspective he taught me? Perhaps he had three writers in his mind. He calls them Afro-Asians. Sorry, Afro-Indians, yeah. Moez Vasanji, Badur Tejani, Peter Nazareth. Referring to them, he writes, my own work, Wizard of a Crow, in which I tried to bring the Eastern philosophies into imaginative discourse with African realities, following in the footprints already made by these writers on the sands of the cultural scene in Africa. The statement reflects an attempt to open an India-Africa window in the writer's house, besides his other window, Caribbean literature. In the cell, while talking about security, Ngũgĩ told me to understand characters so we may be safe. He gave his own examples, and usually talked with his own examples actually, of what he learned interacting with the staff at the University of Nairobi. The staff we both knew. It was an insight into how he portrayed characters in his novels, like a psychologist. In his autobiography, Joseph Anton, a memoir, the Indian Kashmiri writer Salman Rushdie says that when he joined the University of Cambridge, his academic counselor asked him what he wanted to study. Rushdie said psychology. The professor asked him why. Freshman Rushdie replied, because he wanted to understand people. The professor's counselor advised him that for that he needed to study literature. And so Salman Rushdie became a writer. The two Ngũgis worked on the script of Gahika Denda in Gikuyu, their mother tongue. And with the community at Kamiridu, that's important. Where they lived, the Kiambu district was a hotbed of Mau Mau in the 1950s. Not far from Kamiridu was Lari, the place of the most cruel massacre in Kenya's history. Kamiridu itself was a detention village. The Ngũgis wrote from that place where haunting echoes of resistance and pain of torment throbbed community memories like distant drum beats. There, the worker peasant theater of the tortured, the detained, and the heroic Mau Mau was raised on a wooden platform. It unfolded to me like a dream the moment I stepped onto the mud floor of the Kamiridu Community Education and Cultural Center on the first evening of the rehearsal in early 1977. The people saw the suppressed memories brought to life. Speech stricken by police brutality and corruption boldly acted out. Reality and drama merged. Past and present became one. That was the beginning that set the aura surrounding the play, the courage, trepidation. That was the spirit of Kamiridu becoming Kamiridu, the Kamiridu. I do not speak Gikuyu, but the emotions captivated me. The theatre of the oppressed was palpable in folds of assurance of truth, of history, expectations of hope and anxiety. The creative impulse of the collective was like it were the energy of one body, dramatizing the right of Utu. I am because you are. I am poor because you are rich. When Professor Mala Pandarung, sorry Mala, whose PhD was on Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, asked me to write about Kamiridu because she said, in India, we know very little about Kamiridu. My body questioned my mind. How can I give a voice to a dance, song, musical drama that's embodied in me, that's absorbed in feelings, hummed in notes of indigenous tones? Words by themselves have no such lexis or interpretations of the mesmeric sonic and visual images in my diaspora Indian body. Kamiridu was an art encasing two emotions, beauty and fear, and it was exalting. It was like a hunter who knows the lion is around, to use an African proverb, but he must hunt the deer with his bow and arrow, for his children are hungry. Everyone on stage in the audience was a hunter, and the lion was watching over them. But there was strength in doing what people must do under repression. Such a dream is spoken about in a poem. So I wrote to Ngũgĩ when he asked me again to write about Kamiridu as an Indian. In fact, he did it until his last breath, so to speak. I will read a few lines from this poem in closing. Ngũgĩ was on dialysis, going to the hospital 3 times a week on even days, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. I had them on my calendar, for I read to him. Excuse me, in between our talks, when he had the strength to listen, the Gen Z theatrical songs and protests were happening concurrently in Kenya's cities. Their resolute marches were effective, and the energy of their creative impulse of a collective voice was penetrating. There are valiant street performers today in the same streets and breadth as of Kamaridu 48 years ago. They make people's art of resistance while the fear of repression hangs over them, inspiring them even more the right to defy arrogance of despotism. Concurrently, the returning dream of Kenya's landscape of memories is displayed in the personal active voices in Kamaridu Afterlives on social media YouTube channel. So my poem. You see, Ngũgĩ, I don't speak Kikuyu, but what I know is what my body told me. Something remarkable, wondrous, historical, magical in the making, something extraordinary, astonishing, historical, magical in the making, something that was under the eyes of cruelty's rule, beauty and fright unfolding in the shimmer of the red setting sun. Cage creativity set free the bird on wings of dream. The song of Kameridu and Utu soared to the sky. That's how Kameridu was to me, Ngũgĩ. You who resides with the ancestors under the shade of the lone tree on the savannah. The beauty of dawn was yet to come and create the break in the dark sky. We waited and hoped. Thank you. Dear participants, I wish you a wonderful conference. Let your creativity open wings on dreams, and we have more such fellowships in literature with clandestine literature and people's theater side by side, remembering Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, the people's writer, among the sons of literature of Global South. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Somjee. If you were talking to face, I'm sure you would hear a hall of resounding applause. We're all, I think, deeply moved by your willingness to share your personal experience of Ngũgĩ, walking us through his life, relating his life to his work, and relating his work to the people's movement, the power of community voices, sharing your experience of Kamiridu firsthand, what we have only read in texts and taught in the third person. We also thank you for sharing your close association with Ngũgĩ during the underground, as he and others that you worked with struggled to contest the suppression of democracy. What was particularly thought-provoking was your pondering over Ngũgĩ's call to you to speak of Kamiridu as an Indian, your reaction to that and how you wonderfully interwoven into your paper, how you've given us an insight of Ngũgĩ's knowledge and interest in Indian philosophy and Indian writing, how you have revisited the gray area of Indian and African relations, and how Ngũgĩ himself has also addressed the stereotype of the Asian Dukanwala as an exploitative businessman, and also how he's given us an insight of the involvement of the Kenyan nation in the independence movement. You've spoken from the heart as a fourth generation Afro-Asian. And you've also shared with us your first-hand experience of this radical professor, writer, and active, as you put it, revolutionary organizer. I'm sure all of us on this side of the Indian Ocean could relate to Ngũgĩ's call to revert to storytelling in the mother language, to fall back on the use of our mother tongues and the tremendous loss when we don't. Today, perhaps we are finally waking up to Ngũgĩ's dream for Caribbean, African, Asian, South American literary exchanges that go beyond just tokenism. And the need to open doors to explore South-South legacies even further. And finally, I think the very important note that you ended on is to remind all of us that perhaps the most fruitful way of keeping Ngũgĩ's legacy alive is to commit ourselves to pledge for a more equal world that is free of bias, all sort of bias, and to work towards it at the grassroots level and not at the level of intellectuals. So once again, we're tremendously indebted to you. And I am sure this has been a very enriching experience for all those who have joined the Zoom room, as well as all those who are watching this being streamed live on YouTube. So thank you. And I think we should add your name to this trio of Vasanji, Bahadur, and Peter Nazareth, because of the tremendous work that you have written and the novels that you have written, which will give a completely different perspective to the Afro-Asian interface. So thank you again very much. And thank you for your wonderful time sense. Wonderful, your timing of your talk that was so rich. Thank you very much. I request Rima now to please ask Dr. Nandini Sen to take over.
Thank you, Professor Mala, and thank you, Professor Somjee. As we now move on to our plenary sessions, I request Professor Nandini to introduce our first plenary speaker, Professor Chimalum Nwanko.
I think there has been a bit of a problem that Professor Nwanko is facing with his internet connectivity. So Professor Joseph has joined and I can see him. Hi, Joe. Thanks so much for coming in before time because Professor Nwanko was having a bit of a problem with his internet. So I think we will proceed with Rima, can we just give ourselves 1 minute to check if Professor Nwanko is also in the meeting? He's not sure.
Yes,
He says he can see us, but there seems to be, I mean, he's not sure whether we can hear him.
He's in the meeting.
Can we check that, or we check that after we've had Professor McLaren?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No.
Sorry, who's speaking? Is that Joseph? No, is that Chimalum?
This is Chimalum. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can hear you.
Okay. Okay. So, do you want me to
but
go?
We can't see you.
You can't see me, right? Okay.
Rima, how do we address this?
No, he'll have to switch on because I've requested.
Professor Nandini, maybe Professor Joseph could start until we
Yeah,
that's what I'm thinking. Okay, Professor Chimalum has also come in. So now between the two of you, both very eminent people are here with us. So shall we proceed as per schedule, or shall we, you take a decision?
Should I go
on? Yes, Professor Chimalum. Please continue.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry about all the difficulties.
Okay.
But at least if you can hear me, I'm
glad
fine.
you're here.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Okay.
Well, I gave you my title last night. I hope you got it right. From the barrel of Ngũgĩ's pen. Okay, the predicates, selected epices of production and pitfalls. Well, I'd like to begin
Professor
by...
Nwanko, I will introduce you very briefly, and
Okay.
you can introduce your topic. I have your topic, but you will speak about.
Okay.
On a personal note first, I have had the honor of meeting both Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, for which I feel so grateful. And this was such an absolutely brilliant speech from Dr. Somjee that we had, where he talked so passionately about his deep relationship with Ngũgĩ. I've also had this great privilege of knowing Professor Nwanko and Professor McLaren for, again, a very long time. Absolutely brilliant scholars who worked very closely, who have worked very closely towards South-South dialogue, something which we have been talking about for a very long time. Without further ado, I will introduce Professor Nwanko, and then he will take us through his paper and his thoughts on Ngũgĩ. Once again, thank you so much for joining in spite of the time difference, in spite of the technical glitches. So Professor Chimalum Nwanko reads English and Dramatic Arts at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. At Nsukka, he was one of the student editors of Omabe, the Nsukka Poetry Monthly, also an editor of the Muse, a well-known students' journal. He was in the tradition of a very active student of the department, a president of the English Association, and one of the roles that students enjoyed in those days. Nwanko had graduate degrees, MFA, MA, and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. He came back from the USA to teach at the University of Nigeria in 1983, but returned in 1987 as a visiting assistant professor at East Carolina University, Greenville in North Carolina. In 1989, he left Greenville for North Carolina State University as an associate professor in Raleigh to teach English, world literature, and creative writing. In 2003, he moved to North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro as a full professor, where he served as chairman of the Department of English and Speech for 4 years. From 2010 to 2011, he was visiting professor at Nnamdi Azikiwe University. From 2012 to 2014, he was professor of English and creative writing, as well as writer in residence at Nigeria Turkish Nile University in Abuja. Very popular on the conference circuit that I can vouch for. Nwanko has delivered many keynote addresses in universities in US and Nigeria. 6 international keynotes were delivered in universities in US and Nigeria. He is a very well-known writer and a widely acclaimed poet. And he has countless books to his credit. I would recommend Googling him and getting to know more about him. He's also very interested in philosophy and writes ardently on philosophic texts. I will not, I mean, this is an amazing bio, but I think his words will speak for itself. So welcome aboard, Professor Nwanko, and we are waiting to learn from you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I came on board at last, and also very happy with all these things you said about me. And I'm looking at myself wondering if it's me you're talking about.
It's all you and much more that I could not read out. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. My article, which the title of my paper, which I sent you, is From the Barrel of Ngũgĩ's Pen, the predicates of predicates, selected epices of production, and pitfall of pitfalls. And I'd like to begin by saying that Ngũgĩ's fictive world is a Heraclitean world of possible futures. That world anticipates a utopia at its terminus. That world begins from a shattered society equilibrium in colonial Kenya and develops toward a violently burgeoning dystopia, then a future of positive possibilities, a utopia which American novelist John Updike reacts to as a journey without a destination. As nebulous as that may sound, for Ngũgĩ Thiong'o, his visionary passion is steady and not stymied by all that. There are many ways of pursuing a comprehension of his oeuvre. One of the clearest to me is to upgrade or downgrade his corpus as a thesis, a hypothesis, and then a speculative production. And how do we pursue such a gamut? We must recognize the creation of a multi-folate world, set up in careful worlds, into a most engaging palimpsest. If there were to be a continental comparative taxonomy of literary productions in Africa, a forensic review would easily establish that the gravity of colonial modus operandi and concomitant upheaval in each colony generated peculiar predicates of creative strategies. Let us select some epices of regional contest between the imperial colonial powers and indigenous territories. The colony of South Africa graduated its capture through a series of violent struggles to the institutions of the infrastructure of apartheid. Colonization rode on the back of the bronco of Calvinistic mythology toward the totalitarian racist domination of the polity. The casus belli was land, land, land. The answer by indigenous creative forces was violent responses, typified or indeed characterized by isomorphic, iconic, dramatic texts, like Louis Nkosi's Rhythm of Violence. The plays of Athol Fugard rode on the same train, along with the works of Dennis Brutus, Alex Laguma, and even white pioneers like Alan Patton, the author of Cry the Beloved Country, or the later Nobel laureates Coetzee and Nadine Gordimer. South African literature until recently was haunted by the ghost of apartheid. The literary productions of Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe, rode on the same impetus. How do we recapture the land, the heritage, and the foundational national myths before the imperial colonial eruption? Alexander Kenengoni, Robert Zeliza, Chinjara Hove, and Yvonne Veria. They all variously tried to answer that question. Their strategies were stitches of lost, moribund, and extant memories of war and political conflict. Literary production stayed with that strain or grain. As in apartheid South Africa, the land issue and the colonial capture was nationally, excuse me, was nationally reckless and without ethnic boundaries. Ethnic burden was even, and so you might say that foundationally speaking, nostalgia and recall were intrinsic creative forces emanating from the same base. The third example from this protracted preamble is the Nigerian colony. The issue of land was nowhere near the center of literary productions. Wole Soyinka's Yoruba Ogunism, in juxtaposition with the iconic Igbo Chinua Achebe, read like productions from two different countries. No matter the scope or optics you deploy with Soyinka, the modus and fulcrum remained Ogun, the deity of all crafts, physical or concrete fabrications and constructions. Achebe, of course, stayed with the damage of the Igbo psyche and its engagement with colonial forces, an elastic agon, which all nations which went through imperial control find experientially compelling. So essentially, imperial colonial gravitas dictated the character and nature of authorial gravitas. Assault on indigenous cultural foundations and formations differed from country to country in the continent. Look at this claim carefully, and you will see why Ngũgĩ produced the way he did. Complexity of eruption demanded an indigenous cultural reaction where literary production must place that complexity in the foreground. Let us look at the author's background and its imperatives. Ngũgĩ's birth area in Kikuyu country was close to the areas where white land appropriation and occupation and supplantation of indigenous people was most severe. So up close to the writer was existential pain via a direct family involvement, the angst of deprivation and associated cultural and socioeconomic woes. Relate this to the baggage of imperialism with a composite of imperial bureaucracy and education. excuse me, and the Christian religion, and you have the whole mix upon which Ngũgĩ predicated his authorial political campaign. To any sensitive child of colony, the problems were clear. It was a battle against an enemy whose formation had easily recognizable fronts. A clearer delineation could comfortably read the whole corpus of Ngũgĩ's production as therefore as a concentricity of engagement. The comparison with Chinua Achebe is always useful, if inescapable. Their trajectories as writers dealing with the injury of colony is the same, but the character of engagement markedly different. Chinua Achebe defined the trajectory of his fictive universe in historical realism, causal and linear, incrementally. Ngũgĩ defined his own universe in contours of worlds, albeit incrementally too. For the purposes of this presentation and these circumstances, I would like to state that my absolute desire is for me to compel what has not been so compelled by most readers or scholars of African literatures. So I use the Grammarly word predicate to suggest that, quite peculiarly speaking, the drivers of Ngũgĩ's works in general are in the deep graves of his formative days as a Kikuyu child. What happened in those formative years? Gikuyu land was given to the Agikuyu by Ngai, God, the author of all the area favored by the colonial master. The Kikuyu land cosmogony included the founding parent, Gikonya Mumbi. So we have in the authorial DNA a foundation where myth and public memory is in chiasmus, that is separately braided. The fictive world of Ngũgĩ's works enjoys that matrix. There is nothing like that in all African literature. The closest, probably in approximation, is in the Ogunism of Wole Soyinka. The great inseparable difference is that in Soyinka, what you may call atavistic intervention runs into a realm that is remote from the kind of contact politics which characterizes Ngũgĩ's works and world. Ogun has nothing to do with the British imperialism in Nigeria. Ogun is relevant only to Yoruba craftsmen, not so for Ngũgĩ. Note that there is something that is almost Zionist in Ngũgĩ's works, something that establishes an isomorphic relationship between the fictive world and the real world. The Ngũgĩ corpus anticipates the consummation of a Gikuyu utopian destiny, and every work of Ngũgĩ generates or regenerates a movement toward that destiny. That mix transmutes the authorial complex or contest into a play involving myth and a collective public memory, warring an extensive imperial and neocolonial eruption. Ngũgĩ's task is in every work is to reshape the terrain artistically or aesthetically, but definitely technically. For Ngũgĩ, technically and practically or pragmatically, the enemy is constant, but he remains the same. The enemy may be chameleon in character, but the mission of domination is the same. And if it is so, how best do we fight that enemy to prevail? To pursue this authorial trajectory fruitfully in this limited space and time, the best approach is to say with what I consider the apices, the various heights or peaks of the author's collective engagement. We can do this by staying with the achievement of each selected text that defines Ngũgĩ's program. Well, the enemy is colonialism, whether as something insidious or something in its matured cumulus as neocolonialism. And here are Ngũgĩ's textual responses. In Weep Not Child, the enemy is the ravenous clouds, the forces which dominate the colony. Ngũgĩ's approach in this first well-known work is to recreate circumstances which mimic his own background. The hero is handicapped by the ravenous presence of colonial forces. They are the forces which exploit the lack in the world of the protagonist. The rebellion of the indigenous or the forces of resistance, typified by the Mau Mau and their stubborn supporters. Land has been seized and the people cowed by the colonial master's presence. The seized land is like the soul of the people. What manifests in this debut work has the foundations of all the things which feature down the road of the author's development. You may look at Ngũgĩ's whole corpus as an ideological quest. The author's choice is predicated on the rifts in the land between indigenous forces and circumstances related to the colonial presence in all its ramifications. The conclusion of that novel is a dynamic eschatology anticipating a future which unfolds inexorably. We must see the river between as a drop from the conflictual apex of Ngũgĩ's thought, a serious aspect of the narrative undergirding Ngũgĩ's ideological posture. The onslaught of imperial culture is insidious, manifesting in the divisive responses of the people to the practice of circumcision. The indigenous culture loses, but it is nonetheless a battle fought with conviction. The heroine dies not because the indigenous culture is weaker, but because her death strengthens the praxis in the conflictual bowl of the text. In A Grain of Wheat, the predicate is still the loss of land, violently betting heroic action as opposed to the collective action uniting all the Kenyans who face or combat the colonial presence directly or indirectly. The question facing the praxis for revolution is, what is the best formation for contesting the colonial presence? Ngũgĩ's narrative is a meta-critical watershed narrative. It is also meta-critical because the previous narratives which drive revolutionary action is orthodox. The people rise up and the upheaval is driven by political orthodoxy or conventional revolutionary orthodoxy. In Weep Not Child, the hope of the indigenous people is in the children of tomorrow who challenge the status quo, either via education or a direct violent action while mimicking the master's way and the tools of progress in the context of modernity. The master's way is both academic and direct economic exploitation. You may say there is a Manichaean theme at work in the consciousness of the people and in the kind of narrative deployed by the author at this point in his creative work. That Manichaeanism is temporarily negotiated in the river between, where the battle for the soul of the people is in the choice between tradition and modernity, isomorphically represented in the people's attitude to the practice of circumcision. The fictive burden of A Grain of Wheat is the definition of an unproductive old way. I define that way as metacritical and watershed in posture and authorial trajectory. Ngũgĩ prepares readers for a departure into a Marxist reading of the world. There are examples of heroic action and heroic choices in the conduct of all the characters in this story. Mogo, Karanja, Gikonyo, and Mumbi or Kahika. Everybody falls short in terms of dedication, sacrifice, social commitment, compassion, and indeed blemish, and so forth. Good and evil become distributive in Ngũgĩ's hands. Of course, justice and fairness become decentralized. How do we judge people in the world? And how do we judge ourselves to be fair in terms of social justice? How does Kenya or Africa understand the enormity of its socioeconomic and political crisis? These are the kind of questions raised by A Grain of Wheat. The answer is available in a paraphrase of Chinua Achebe's proffered answer regarding the African experience in history. We have to find that out by revisiting the vicissitudes of Africa buried in what I call repeatedly the agon in Africa's collision with the West. The agon is struggle. I've also suggested repeatedly that the artistic and critical approach has to be forensic. We cannot be successful in our forensics examination without an awareness of the fact that such a task must be ontological. What in the albumen, the foundation of the African consciousness, can explain the multiple crises of modern Africa? That is a great question that Ngũgĩ thought he must find the answer as a thinker and writer. A labor distributed throughout his writings, fiction, drama, essays, and the polemical. Petals of Blood, I consider a magnificent extrapolation of all the inchoate humanistic issues and questions raised through character action in a grain of wheat. If a grain of wheat is Ngũgĩ's watershed, Petals of Blood is the apogee of his craft, his ultimate emergence. There he affirms the old defensive riposte of the aborted mass murder of the British Parliament and King James I in the Gunpowder Plot of 1604. Desperate diseases require desperate remedies, said the culprit. The state of mind which produced I will marry when I want is the same consciousness, the same kind of consciousness which produced Petals of Blood. Whatever followed the text follows as a replumbing of the depths of Ngũgĩ's craft and vision. This is where the author begins the historic baptism of his art as Afro-Marxism. No delineation could be more technically inclusive. Critics who find flaws with the text are crassly Euro-American. They are unexposed to the storytelling traditions of the thousands of ethnicities which make up the African continent. Petals of Blood is a very careful breed of the best aspects of African folktales and Marxist humanism. Something has impinged on the consciousness of people, triggering a quest for remediation. Ilmorog, the center of much of the textual action, is the haven of possible restitution. The place is like a palpable thing, actuating all kinds of possibilities and drivers of creativity and innovation. Fictional time and real time, past and present, past strife and contemporary difficulties are all composites. The use of songs and proverbs and indirection that is part and parcel of the tradition of African storytelling are embellishments employed by the text. Thengeta, the transformative drink, is like the vibranium of the nifty great movie called The Black Panther. Thengeta is a symbol of indigenous Black creativity, but like all other things produced by the African imagination, it is either wrongfully appropriated or flagrantly abused. All the characters are reacting to the same social forces, whether it's the war of independence spearheaded by the Mama or the pressures from capitalism and neocolonialism. If nothing works out as a contest between the Kenyan people and the forces of colonial and neocolonialism, between the bourgeois and the proletariat is supposed to, it is not really a problem. It is not because the old cliche, poetic justice, fails, but because a true Marxist ideologue will always hang on to a luta continua. The struggle continues, as it does even in Ngũgĩ's non-Marxist texts. In technical execution and philosophical gravitas, there are only two African novels I have on the same scale with Petals of Blood. There is Ben Okri's The Famished Road and The Last Harmattan of Alusine Domba by Sultan. I have not included Wizard of the Crow because it is in a class of its own. Devil on the Cross and Wizard of the Crow are like one massive text, with the former as appetizer and prologue, and Matigari as the promontory of their becoming. The two texts are wicked in wit and wisdom, parabolic and hyperbolic, disturbingly real and surreal at once. From a deeply African perspective, Petals of Blood unfolds with biting anger and acrid humor, and the caricature of all and sundry involved in the scams and chicanery, the oppression and exploitation that is the bane of progress in all Africa. The people pay the price of the Western presence, and some locals do not help matters by joining the forces of oppression and humiliation. The evil forces of capitalism spare no one, and Ngũgĩ is inspiring too in the deployment of resources from indigenous folkways. The evil forces of capitalism spare no one, and Ngũgĩ is inspiring too in the deployment of resources and indigenous folkways, the eclectic creative choices are great reminders of the kind of technical ferment and exciting action which marked the no-boundaries artistic atmosphere of Western productions in the 1960s. It was there in the wild experiments of Antoine Artaud in the French theater in the 1940s. It was there in the irreverent dramaturgy of the guerrilla theater in the United States in the 1960s. So too in the tools of Soviet socialist realism in about the same period. Ngũgĩ's earthy deployment of what one may regard as the raw African modes of expression had the power of both startling novelty and shock. The effectiveness of Ngũgĩ's art and devices rocked the conservative establishment and the colonial capture, hence Ngũgĩ's problem with the law. Ngũgĩ presents in character action purposely a fictive world in an unsanitized, morally noxious and evil human environment, where satire and irony, the zany and the magical, ingenious folklorist enchantment compel in a reader an unstoppable awareness of what the issues are and the rectitude of authorial onslaught of the enemy in what manifests intensely as what you may call scatological in its relentless weaponry. I have suggested my intention to look at Ngũgĩ's work in terms of predicates and pitfalls. I've also projected a movement in terms of trajectory from a fairly sustainable thesis to a speculative zenith, which I said appreciatively in terms of perspicacity that John Updike is right in characterizing Ngũgĩ's peculiar vision and artistry as a journey without a destination. It is fair to isolate Ngũgĩ's moral campaign as a classroom extrapolation of the Mau Mau rebellion and battle against the British colonies. The recurrent reference to loss of land stretches from the concrete loss of land to the recuperation of lost ethnic memories as a result of the steady diminishing of the power of African languages, a consequence of colonial cultural imperialism. It is fair to state firmly that Ngũgĩ's predicates and the practice which instigates or incentivizes the bellicose posture of his literary and political campaign for reparation and restitution are realized in the historical realism of his projections. Independence comes to Kenya. More people become exposed to Western education. Women acquire more power and assume greater agency in society. A new generation emerges to continue. And it's also fair to state that the power of imperialism and colonialism is a phoenix. From the ashes of its death, neocolonialism emerges to perpetuate injustice. All the characters from Whip-Not Child reappear in new morphs in Ngũgĩ's work. There is always a Kenyan idealist looking for freedom, either through education or the acquisition of wealth and economic or political power. So too the exploitative white characters, colonial representations of evil, and even the treacherous Black Kenyans reappear in different morphs, text after text, with complexity in both oppression and exploitation. The position of women in the short end of the patriarchal chain and stick is a constant in an undulating economic terrain where even when women rise temporarily, they still fall. Praise because of gender or a classism that is irremediably flawed. The artistic palimpsest replicates the templates established in the beginning of Ngũgĩ's writings, either significantly or you may say slightly attenuated. The palimpsest is an omnibus one because its context intellectually and artistically extend proboscis into all generic excursions. In drama, in essays, and the polemical, and even in journalistic writings which predate the halcyon days of his fame. Generally, His position as an ace and iconic African novelist cannot be impugned. In drama, I Will Marry When I Want is a fine play. So also is The Trial of Didanke Martin. We may not admit the Black Hermit in that league. However, all his essays are lucid and intellectually engaging in thrust and in relevance in Africa's concerns and battle for real independence from colonial, neo-colonial, and imperialistic control and manipulation. And where or what we consider the pitfalls in Ngũgĩ's thoughts and craft, where the criticism that Ngũgĩ's writings are didactic is accurate, but please caveat emptor. This is a constant in most traditional African oral literature. African oral literature instructs all the time, from proverbs and dages to the most royal panegyrics. The allegorical components of Ngũgĩ's work may also be considered too quaint, but the effectiveness cannot be underestimated in its cultural, historical, and political circumstances. His Marxist ideological application has been criticized as too precious and inappropriate for the political and geographical national circumstances. Yes, but there is no other way, ideologically, of making this art a national critical enterprise to obviate the suggestion that the whole thing is factional, because what happened in Kikuyu land did not happen all over Kenya. Finally, a most serious pitfall or critical point about Ngũgĩ's thought is his dogmatic insistence that real African literature must be written in African languages. Before his Afro-Marxism, as an African, I consider Marxist ideology imperialistic, pedantic, and perfunctory. Under an ontological microscope, both choices do not work for me. Ngũgĩ's great career marker is his honesty and passionate engagement and sentiment. From the right or left, ideological overkills diminish and impair. As appropriate and as insightful and visionary as the psychocultural and political benefits may appear. One final word about the African literature and language debate. The United Kingdom is a very poor and weak example because the ethnic composition and the geographical and historical circumstances are markedly different. The phasing out of French or Latin from the United Kingdom is a cakewalk, if you would kindly forgive me for that cliche. Ngũgĩ's preferred solution for the use of African languages is easily acceptable. If it is easily acceptable, why has all of Kenya not warmed up to it? Transiting from French or Latin to English in Britain is not as easy as transiting from African language to one preferred lingua franca. The African continent has over 1,000 ethnic languages. Nigeria alone has over 300 languages, each as different as French is from Japanese. From where do you initiate this kind of program and with such giant walls of diversity? The African language and literature debate began at Makerere, Uganda in 1961. It will probably remain on that contentious table forever. Nonetheless, that does not diminish the issue as a most worthy proposal from a worthy, eminent mind, an icon of literary productions with a legacy that we cannot begin to forget in a hurry. For many of us who consider ourselves stakeholders in the possibility of that application, from the 1998 University of Texas at Austin African Literature Association Conference, Chinua Achebe was on the high table with Ngũgĩ or Thiong'o. Here is what transpired when the issue of language came up at question time. Chinua Achebe's voice may sound almost cynical, but quite wise, pragmatic, and as always, inimitable. Here is what he said. If you don't like the English language, don't use it. The decibel of laughter and applause was embarrassing. I would add that before horses and carriages and automobiles, most people use their feet. I believe that our internecine pointless culture wars about language would end if one simply regarded the English language just as an automobile. The automobile, even today, is definitely more comfortable for most highway travels, but still, not everybody can always afford it. I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Nwanko. And you pretty much, I mean, unfortunately, we don't have a Q&A after the plenary talks, or I'm sure there would be so much discussion because you have covered the length of scholarship on Ngũgĩ, literally. You have talked most importantly about the land issue, which effectively has been something that has been central to Ngũgĩ's works, and particularly the Mau Mau movement, which again has been central to his work. And from there, you have gone on to talk about, again, the DQ land, which had been given, and that became the genesis for the struggle, the Mau Mau struggle, and effectively a very, very core concern, particularly the trial of Dedan Kimathi, something which we have been teaching in the University of Delhi for many years. So you talk about that, you talk about the assault on indigenous cultures. I mean, this is something that the world is grappling with. I mean, we need Ngũgĩ and many more like him, many more voices. It's a significant voice that we have lost, which is fighting for indigenous voices in today's day and age. And then you talk about the African consciousness, and you talk about trying to find answers to the problems that exist in Africa through the African consciousness. Again, when you say Africa, I would say for the world, we need to find answers. I mean, there is so much, there is the gap between the haves and the have-nots have increased and are continuing to increase so phenomenally that, we need answers for those, and therefore we miss voices such as these. You speak of humanism. You speak, of course, of all his seminal works. You speak of storytelling traditions, again, something which is very seminal to the Indian way of thinking. Storytelling is what we have grown up with, and storytelling is what Ngũgĩ taught us. And such incredible storytelling, which is not just art for art's sake, but it is for the sake of opening people's eyes to the kind of dehumanization of people that is going on, and the kind of, how the gap between the haves and the have-nots are increasing globally. And then you talk very correctly about how this struggle continues, and I think it is scholars such as you and all the scholars present here, at least through our pens, we can take it forward. Though Ngũgĩ wouldn't agree, he would want people to be center stage and fighting for the rights of the dispossessed. You talk about the language issue, the debate between Achebe and Ngũgĩ. Again, something we're going to have so many papers later, which I'm sure will be addressing these issues. And you talk about the multiple languages that exist in the African continent, and you talk about translations and translatability, because unless one gets to read the other languages, which are so many, which are so varied, how will people even sort of communicate with each other? So that continues to be a problem. So thank you, sir. You've raised such incredibly pertinent issues, and you've left us with so many thoughts and to deliberate upon, and to write and to think about. So once again, thank you on behalf of all of us for sparing your valuable time and for joining us today. And we have learned so much from this incredible lecture of yours. Thank you, sir. And namaskar.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate being a part of this conference, and I hope everything goes on smoothly to the end. Thank you again.
Thank you, sir.
All right, bye-bye.
We hope so too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next speaker is Professor Joseph McLaren. Very graciously, he has been waiting because Professor Nwanko was having some joining, he was not able to join, and that sort of I kind of panicked and reached out to Professor Joseph so that he joins us. I will just read out very briefly his bio note before he takes center stage. Just give me a minute. Joseph McLaren is Professor Emeritus, Hofstra University, where he taught African American and African literature. His publications include a variety of articles on literature and culture. He's the author of Langston Hughes, Folk Dramatist in Protest Tradition, 1921 to 1943. This came out in 1997. In addition, he co-edited Pan-Africanism Updated, which came out in 1999, and African Visions, 2000, and edited 2 volumes of the collected works of Langston Hughes, The Big Sea, in 2002, and I Wander as I Wander in 2002, with legendary jazz artist Jimmy Heath. He co-authored I Walked with Giants in 2010, Heath's autobiography. Professor McLaren also authored Benjamin Quay and Oke Nadibi, Migration and Diasporic Encounters, in the Routledge Handbook of the New African Diasporic Literature in 2024. Thank you, Professor, for joining us, and we are waiting to learn. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You can hear me. You can hear me.
Yes, we can. We can hear and see you. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's an honor and a privilege, and I'd like to thank BMN and Bharati College, and especially Dr. Sen for this invitation. I know of her great work in African literature and her creative work as well. It's also good to see Brother Chima. I enjoyed his talk very much and reminded me of so many conferences and so many meetings. So my talk essentially is a comparative one. I wanted to put in conversation 2 works, one of which Chima already mentioned, and that is The River Between, and Toni Morrison's Sula, to put these works in conversation. The works by these 2 giants. Here we are now in the 21st century, in the globalized AI world. So what happens when we look back now? When we look back, not quite 100 years into the time frames of these works, but perhaps so, but a generation or more from when these writers initially produced their novels. So I will go ahead, I will read some of this presentation. Ngũgĩ Thiong'o and Toni Morrison, 2 giants of novelistic literary achievement, can be placed in conversation as it relates to the teaching of their novels. Ngũgĩ's The River Between, 1965, and Morrison's Sula, 1973, suggests certain parallel pedagogical issues, although emerging from different narrative situations. African literature and African American literature, broadly conceived, share analytical realities and approaches. These include historical, geographic, and political realities. As prominent novelists, Black novelists, I would say, both Ngũgĩ and Morrison experimented with novelistic form and language, their early novels showing artfully presented narrative strategies. By using The River Between and Sula as pedagogical examples, it is possible to compare differing paradigms involving race, class, gender, ethnicity, culture, language, and religion. Both works allow for binary interpretations in that the principal characters, Wayaki and Sula, reflect on a micro level various aspects of divided communities. Mukuyu and Camino in 1930s and after Kenya, and the Bottom and the Valley in Medallion, Ohio in the US. Comparatively, one of the primary challenges in teaching African literature and African American literature is showing how race, ethnicity, language, colorism, and national histories function as underlying categories in the shaping of fictional works. For many African novelists writing in European languages during the colonial era, the role of the novel was to uncover, among other things, to uncover the internal and external forces generated by the colonial encounter and their impact on communities and personal relationships. Encompassing similar mid-20th century periods, African American novelists often explored the legacy of slavery and racial segregation, turning as well to gender issues and class considerations. Furthermore, caste can be added to the analysis by including ideas developed in Isabel Wilkerson's work, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, published in 2020. Ngũgĩ's The River Between can be approached on the thematic level, accessible pedagogically to students unfamiliar with African literature or African culture in general. Broad categories can facilitate unpacking the work, many of which are literary or cultural areas for multi-disciplines. Placing the novels in conversation, the parallels between characters can be used to unpack binaries and other cultural issues. The Sula-Nell sisterhood and friendship, and the Muthoni-Nyambura familial sisterhood are workable approaches. Ngũgĩ's approach to spatial geography demonstrates the binary context, the oppositions within the levels of Gikuyu society, as in his description of the two ridges that lay side by side. One was Kameno, the other Makuyu. This spatial dichotomy, where the valley is the separating or dividing geographical marker, is tied to what he calls sleeping lions which never woke, and foreground the divisions, especially relating to traditional Gikuyu belief systems and the Christian converted spaces where Makuyu and Joshua reside. The spatial division is nevertheless potentially unified by the curative Honia River, which was the soul of Kameno and Makuyu. It joined them, and men, cattle, wild beasts, and trees were all united by this life stream. Morrison's use of spatial dichotomies or binaries have differing significations, where Morrison also creates an inverted geography, ironically labeled a nigger joke, and concerning the 19th century origins of the Black community of Medallion, in which that part of town where the Negroes lived, that part they called the bottom, in spite of the fact that it was up in the hills. The rocky and seemingly unwanted hill land, inverted as the bottom in agricultural terms, the desired space, foisted symbolically on the African descended community, is brought into its early 20th century reality. Morrison's Medallion also has a river as a geographical marker. The absurdity of enslaved African labor used on plantations and small-scale farms is revealed in a fable, in a story created by Morrison, the so-called bargain, in which the enslaved person is supposedly granted property and freedom by a good white farmer for his forced labor. This can resonate as well in the larger comparative point of land dispossession in colonial Kenya and the intrusion and privilege of settler societies. So in Ngũgĩ's work and in Morrison's work, as I quote from Morrison's work here, freedom was easy. The farmer had no objection to that. But he didn't want to give up any land, so he told the slave that he was very sorry that he had to give him valley land. He had hoped to give him a piece of the bottom. The slave blinked and said he thought valley land was the bottom. The master said, "Oh no, see those hills? That's bottom land, rich and fertile." Furthermore, the bottom-valley binary or dichotomy is joined in the historical trickery to another up-down, high-low representation, when, to convince the black subject, the white farmer asserts, "High up from us," but when God looks down, it's the bottom. That's why we call it so. It's the bottom of heaven, best land there is. This inequity is indicative of the legacy of slavery seen in white-black binaries. Nevertheless, Morrison is able to render an additional pattern of inverted logic. Quote, "White people lived on the rich valley floor in that little river town in Ohio, and the blacks populated the hills above it, taking small consolation in the fact that every day they could literally look down on the white folks." In the latter post-World War II 1950s history of bottom valley associations, Morrison shows the continued reappropriation and manipulation. In both Ngũgĩ and Morrison, the divisions having different causal instances create what Isabel Wilkerson might term as hierarchies, which she relates to the differing understandings of caste and race. She says, caste is fixed and rigid, race is fluid and superficial, subject to periodic redefinition to meet the needs of the dominant caste in what is now the United States. Further, she adds, race does the heavy lifting for a caste system that demands a means of human division. The divisions and hierarchies found in the river between are multiple as well. And although race, as perceived in the US context of principally white versus black, is not the major opposition, ethnicity within the then colonial nation is primarily Gikuyu-centric. Nevertheless, Ngũgĩ does hint at other ethnicities in this novel, as in references to the missionary schools and the ridges beyond. Religion, gender, and sisterhood as issues. The religious oppositions or binaries include the traditional belief system located in Kameno and seen as the descendants of Chege, from where the prophecy emerges, and the Christian converts. To quote, there were the Christians led by Joshua, men of Joshua as they were sometimes called, their home Makuyu. Then there were the people of the tribe. I want to unpack the use of the term tribe in this early novel of Ngũgĩ at some point. And there were the people of the tribe who had always been against the mission and its faith. Kameno was, as it were, their home or base. I think Chimalum alluded to this. The intervening or inextricable issue is FGM, female genital mutilation, not critically identified as such by Ngũgĩ, but as circumcision in that novel. As seen through Muthoni, shows the push and pull factors that generate the indeterminate spaces. Muthoni is drawn into this space, but like Wayaki, is torn between competing belief systems and practices, the white man's faith, as Ngũgĩ terms it, and the long-standing heritage of the Gikuyu worldview. To quote, why are we fools? Muthoni, she shook Nyambura. Father and mother are circumcised. Are they not Christians? Circumcision did not prevent them from being Christians. I too have embraced the white man's faith. However, I know it is beautiful. Oh, so beautiful to be initiated into womanhood. You learn the ways of the tribe. Yes, the white man's God does not quite satisfy me. I need something more. The Muthoni-Nyambura sisterhood contains the oppositions, which are potentially hierarchical. While Muthoni seeks the empowerment she believes can be found in a practice that has received critical scrutiny, Nyambura also pushes the boundaries or limiting restrictions that would confine her choice of the heart in her love relationship with Wayaki. In all those restricted elements are located family, ethnicity, and religious belief systems. Morrison also presents the complications of sisterhood as friendship for African American women represented by Sula and Nell, or framed within notions of liberation and mobility. Sula, the pariah and outcast, ventures beyond the liminal spaces of medallion, and in doing so transgresses the moral framework of the bottom, which, like the contained traditional village values, is enclosing and limiting and is inherently about sexuality. As stated in relation to Hannah, Sula's mother in the novel, female freedom is always means sexual freedom. And this is what Morrison said in the foreword to the work, a foreword to her own novel, I should say. Female freedom always means sexual freedom, even when, especially when, it is seen through the prism of economic freedom. Further, she states, outlaw women are fascinating, not always for their behavior, but because historically, women are seen as naturally disruptive, and their status is an illegal one from birth if it is not under the rule of men. Sula as pariah or outcast is expressed in sexual terms, and especially through male judgments and suppositions concerning her sexuality. And this is another quote, but it was the men who gave her the final label, who fingerprinted her for all time. They were the ones who said she was guilty of the unforgivable thing, the thing for which there was no understanding, no excuse, no compassion. Potentially about sexuality, as well as the conflicted consciousness of Wayaki, who, like Muthoni, is indicative of the divided ideological position. He is concerned with land. As Ngũgĩ allows the narrator to delve into his consciousness, where did people like Wayaki stand? Had he not received the white man's education? And was this not a part of the other faith, the new faith? In the hierarchical positioning, Christianity and the white man's education are joined to a condition that distances Wayaki and the others who assume the duality of both dispensations from their rooted belief systems, the Chege line of cultural transmission. Comparatively, the complicated process in which enslaved Africans assumed Christian belief systems in the Americas and adopted biblical texts is part of the formation of a generalized African American identity. When in the opening of the fable that I alluded to before, the story told to the enslaved African, heaven is alluded to in spatial terms. The assumption is that the enslaved person has absorbed the belief system and the high-low hierarchy. The relationship between education and mission schools in the formation of elites, Livingstone at Mariashoni, and the song learned, some other areas that I want to investigate in this comparative approach. I want to also consider the relationship between light and dark, which is expressed in the novel by Ngũgĩ in many circumstances and in different places. Furthermore, The divisions brought on by religious conversion are represented in Muthoni's death. There were the Christians led by Joshua, men of Joshua as they were sometimes called. Then there were the people of the tribe, and I think I mentioned this before. The other ridges more or less followed this pattern, and so the ancient rivalry continued, sometimes under this or another guise. It was all confusion building up and spreading under the outward calm of the ridges. So I want to move to the language question. I think I have about 10 minutes left or so. In addition to the geographical, religious, and gender hierarchies and binaries, there's a language question. Certainly this looms large when discussing the legacy of Ngũgĩ. And it is central to his writings after Petals of Blood, when he famously challenged the hegemony of the English language and began writing his novels in Gikuyu. His English novels, nevertheless, presuppose the Gikuyu language as that spoken by his characters. So in a sense, Ngũgĩ was translating even then, but ironically, into English. Pedagogically, students should consider that although they may be reading the novel in English, the characters themselves are not necessarily conducting their interactions or speaking in that language. So there's this level of understanding of translation when Ngũgĩ was writing his novels in English, but perhaps thinking in Gikuyu. I believe that The River Between has been translated into Gikuyu. I heard a rumor as such. I'm not certain if it has been translated, not necessarily by Ngũgĩ himself. Ngũgĩ's well-known stance on this question, stemming back to the late 20th century, is in itself a challenge to the hierarchies and containments of colonial language inheritances through decolonizing the mind, his overall and larger initiative. Although his early novel, The River Between, was written in English, and I mentioned was a question as to whether it has been translated to Gikuyu. Ngũgĩ's use of translation is an exercise in the validation of the Gikuyu language. In a recent interview, relatively recent, in 2001, we see the reiteration of his perspectives. This interview followed the publication of The Perfect Nine, the epic of Gikuyu and Mumbi. And you can hear in this interview a replication, a repetition, a reiteration, the sameness of, if you like, the position that he launched decades before. He says, so they demonize the language of the colonized, and they glorify the language of the colonizer. It becomes the language of intelligence, of education, of intellectual exploration. And it's the opposite, speaking of binaries, and it's the opposite with African languages. They are good for speaking, but not good for ideas, not good for politics. Now, this is despite the fact that Ngũgĩ addresses all of these issues in his English language novels, that is, politics, speaking, and ideas. In the 1960s, as a writer in the early stages of his career, Ngũgĩ's writing in English was considered the expected mode. But like Achebe, the orality elements of his cultural knowledge are evident in the structure of his novels in English and in the context, in what they contain. Although Ngũgĩ had read British authors, he found in Caribbean writers like George Lamming in a parallel literary landscape. Considering The River Between, the use of Gikuyu Mumbi origin story, Chege's prophecy, and the song in the latter section of the novel, which Wayaki had been taught in Syriana by a boy from the country beyond. And I really want to unpack this at some point too, the way the word country is used at this place in the novel, where the British Empire, the imperial center, is so far removed The notion of country is situated here in quite a different way. But the song states, "Father, mother, provide me with pen and slate. I want to learn. Land is gone. Cattle and sheep are not there anymore. What's left? Learning, learning." In this way, language's resistance, though acquired as English, becomes the shield, as in the quote, the shield and spear of learning, and possibly a corollary to the barrel of the pen. In Ngũgĩ's work, do we find any evidence of the Africanized or the Africanization of the English language? Perhaps not in his English-speaking language. Do we find evidence of pidginized languages as we see in perhaps Ken Saro-Wiwa's Sozobor, where the language itself, the structure of the novel, though not in an ethnic or Nigerian indigenous language, is in an Africanization of the English tongue? So this is not in any way to diminish Ngũgĩ's comments on writing in English. They stand as they are, and they are very important and significant. But I wanted to raise this question as to the Africanization of English and its validity as also a language in itself. Comparatively for Morrison, the language question can be conceptualized within the framework of literary voice, finding the voice through which to tell the stories of African Americans. In Sula and her other novels, Morrison's characters voice the tonal elements and timbre of African American speech, Africanized English, not necessarily in the narrative passages, but certainly in the dialogue. Patterns relatable to Morrison's statement about truth in timbre. She began writing fiction because she could not find in the writings of her era the stories that told the way she envisioned the world. Although Morrison admittedly was influenced stylistically by Faulkner and Ellison, she crafts her own literary voice. And I will conclude here. The literary and pedagogical challenges of teaching Ngũgĩ and Morrison in selected works suggest the broader comparative concerns of African and African American cultural production within certain time frames and where binaries and hierarchies can be employed. Race, social equality, liberation, the legacy of slavery, and especially for Morrison, Black women and identity are prominent pedagogical approaches. For African writers like Ngũgĩ, and I'm not meaning here to homogenize African writers, the presentation of localized ethnicities, as in his Gikuyu-centered worldview, anti-colonial resistance, and traditional origins, and language maintenance are available areas. Morrison and Ngũgĩ, the two giants of global Black fiction, will endure as models of creative vitality and commitment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor McLaren. That was absolutely wonderful, and so happy to see you after so long. And you have done something so brilliant, where you've compared the two giants, as you call them, of Black writing. You've compared Ngũgĩ's The River Between and Morrison's Sula. And you talk about very pertinent issues which are going to be discussed now in the coming sessions. You talk gender, you talk ethnicity, and you talk religion. Everything I think we are going to be discussing at length as the conference progresses. And you have talked about how Morrison talks greatly about the slavery and, of course, gender issues, which are central to her work. And then you quote "Sleeping lions which never woke," and you talk about her tongue-in-cheek humor, where she says, the blacks look down on the whites because they get to live on the hill. Not that their living conditions are good, but at least they get to look down on somebody. So that, of course, her sense of humor is incredible, and to have that, to tell a story such as that with that kind of sense of humor. Like they say, I mean, you can only battle sadness with humor. You can only battle this kind of dehumanization with humor, which is seen in her works. You talk about the female genital circumcision. Ngũgĩ talks about it at great length. And of course, there will be opinions for and against, but he takes sides and he talks about it. You talk about education, particularly the missionary education and the kind of influence that it had in the African countries. And of course, you talk about his most seminal text, Decolonizing the Mind. I think we've all grown up reading that book, and it continues to be, I think, one of the most pertinent texts of our times, because what we really need to do is to decolonize our minds. And that, I think, is the most difficult thing to do, given the kind of colonial world that we have grown up in. So decolonizing one's mind is, I think, the toughest task that each one of us has. And it's a constant battle. It's not a one-off thing. It's a constant battle. And that battle needs to be fought at all points of time. And then you talk about the language question. You talk about the position that Ngũgĩ takes. And then you also mentioned that he does not much use the pidgin English, which of course is a language entirely in itself, given how English has been taken over and made into a dialect or a language of its own kind. Your paper has covered multiple issues, and I think these are the key issues which we are going to be discussing over the next 2 days. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us and sharing your insights with us. And I hope you find time to join us over these 2 days. But we are also going to be looking at a public. These lectures are going to go, they have already gone live. They are there for posterity. But I think a publication needs to come out, because we are hearing so many fantastic voices on Ngũgĩ. So thank you so much, Professor McLaren, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts on Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, whom we honor today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was an honor to be a part of this very inspiring conference, and best of luck as it moves forward with the papers and other elements of it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. My closing remarks, it's late evening here in India. I'm very grateful for friends from the US who have joined early in the morning. Today in India, it's late evening. So I begin, I'm going to keep this very brief. I begin with someone I've grown up reading, Tagore. Tagore wrote Africa in 1937, where he apologizes to Africa for what she went through. So I will quote very briefly from Tagore when he says, "Underneath the obscurity of your dark facade lay unknown your human identity, degraded by the collective gaze of derision. And then they arrived, manacles in hand, claws sharper by far than any of your wolves. They arrived, human rustlers and traffickers all, by vanity and arrogance blind, sightless by far than your darkest sunless forests." And he goes on, "Come, poet of this new age, as the last rays of light fade into darkness, take your remorseful place next to the violated woman. Forgive, you plead, hoping to be forgiven like a silver lining upon the clouds of your delirium. May that be, of your civilization, the very last divine pronouncement." This is Tagore in 1937 in a poem called Africa. The person we honor today, Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, we've lost a great voice which spoke on behalf of the dispossessed. I will not speak much about Ngũgĩ because that's what we are going to be doing. The brilliant speakers that we've had today, Professor Somjee, Professor Nwanko, and Professor McLaren, who have covered so much ground on Ngũgĩ. I think I will keep my comments for the end. I will only say about this conference that we have been inundated with abstracts. Initially, this was supposed to be a one-day conference where we had thought we will invite some known speakers, and this is going to be a one-day conference. But it became a 3-day conference because so many of you wrote in, and we are very sorry that we were not able to accommodate everybody. So I think the Ngũgĩ conversation needs to continue. Ngũgĩ says written words can also sing, and we know that. His written words are singing in our ears, even as we talk about him, because, now that we have lost him. But we have been talking about him for a very, very long time. In DU, like I mentioned, in my university, we have been teaching Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o. We have taught the trial of Dead and Timothy. He's an author who has transcended geography, culture, and time. He's an author who continues to remain absolutely relevant in all times. He's an author who teaches us he's an activist author, as we all know. He teaches us to bridge the gap between the haves and the have-nots. He teaches us to stand up for our rights. He teaches us to decolonize our mind. And I think that becomes the mantra with which we should be continuing our lives. We need to decolonize our minds, and we need to stand by the dispossessed. I end by some lines of Ngũgĩ, and I end and I quote: "Our lives are a battlefield on which is fought a continuous war between the forces that are pledged to confirm our humanity and those determined to dismantle it. Those who strive to build a protective wall around it, and those who wish to pull it down, those who seek to mold it, and those committed to breaking it up, those who aim to open our eyes, to make us see the light and look to tomorrow, and those who wish to lull us into closing our eyes. So let us stand with the people who are helping us open our eyes." Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please join us back tomorrow at 10 a.m. as we continue with the conference. And I thank my colleagues here, Professor Mala Pandurang, Professor Rima Jose, and Iti from my college, without whom this conference would not have been possible. Thank you once again, all of you, for joining us.
Thank you and good night, everybody. And we meet again tomorrow morning.
Yes.
Thank you very
Good night, everyone. And thanks, everyone. We meet tomorrow morning.